Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Podcast, a podcast about the life, theology, and practice of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm your host, Corey Tuttle, and my guest today is Dr. Edward Van Slot. Dr. Van Slot is the Special Chair for Systematic Theology and 21st Century Ecclesiology at the University of Groningen and the author of Negativism of Revelation, Bonhoeffer and Barth on Faith and Actualism. Dr. Van Slot, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm glad to be your guest.
Yeah, this is exciting for me. I've recently started to do my PhD at the University of Aberdeen, and I have interviewed my current dissertation advisor, Dr. Philip Ziegler. I've interviewed him before, and every once in a while he will reach out to me with a book and saying, "Hey, this is a really good book. You should have this person on the podcast." So this is before we even started to do this whole doctoral program. He sent me a few months ago saying, "Hey, you should check out this book, and it's perfect because I'm currently working on Bonhoeffer soteriology." So as I joined the program, he asked me, "What are you reading?" I was like, "I'm reading that Edward Van Slot book that you sent me." And he was like, "Oh, perfect. Just read that." And we'll talk about it in a few weeks. So yeah, I've tons of questions, and I've learned so much from your book already. So this should be fun.
Well, thanks.
Yeah. So this book is your dissertation? Yeah?
It is. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Wow. So what's the process there? How did you discover Bonhoeffer, and what led you to write this dissertation?
Yeah, well, how I discovered Bonhoeffer is just as a student, just as you did probably. I can tell a little story about it. It was, the name connected to it is Stephen Williams. You may know his name. He was from Oxford at the moment, I think. He later went to Belfast, so it must have been in 1994, I think. I was a quite a young student then, and he had a quote he was on a conference in the Netherlands on reconciliation, which he was writing at the moment, and this was a Bonhoeffer quote, and I didn't know Bonhoeffer, didn't know him well. I heard his name mentioned, but I didn't know him well. But this quote from Ethics about what Christ did on the cross really intrigued me. And then I went to the bookstore and bought the Ethics. Well, the rest is history, you could say. And so I started reading him, reading, puzzling, and I've never stopped that. And that was so that led me to write. I also was very much interested in Karl Barth and his theology, and I knew that both of those favorite scholars were connected to each other. That they had Bonhoeffer was clearly influenced by Karl Barth. They had met, they had corresponded, but I didn't really get the point of their difference. What was really their difference? Where did they really, was it so big as it seemed to be at the moment? And there was, of course, the book by Andreas Pangritz about Barth and Bonhoeffer, but I was really interested in the young Bonhoeffer, and there were questions in the young Bonhoeffer's book, Act and Being, for instance, which Pangritz didn't cover. And I thought, well, I feel this might be important. I just have to sort it out. So there was a question, and I had to find the answer myself, I think, and that was the reason why I started writing my dissertation.
That's great. You also mentioned in your at the beginning of your book, your dissertation, that you're trying to figure out between the differences of what you call fides quae and fides qua,
yes,
and how those things work together. I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that, about your questions.
Yeah. I do hesitate a little about how to answer that one. When I was working on this, I had a short presentation for other scholars, for tutors and mentors in the Netherlands, and I was telling them about my interest in Barth and Bonhoeffer and my questions, and one of those people there had a really, I found very irritating, but also I think it is also a justified question. The question, yes, but why do you want to know this? And why do you want that I know about this Bonhoeffer-Barth debate? What's going on there? What's the interest for me? And when I was puzzling that question, so why do I want to tell others about the Barth-Bonhoeffer discussion? What's in it for us now? I had the intuition that this might be connected with the concept of faith. It was an intuition, and I think it was quite a lucky intuition. So when I explored that one, I came, of course, on the issue of fides qua, or how do you pronounce it in English?
I mean, it's Latin, but, so I just guessed.
Yeah. And I felt, well, this touches on the critique of Bonhoeffer, the point of critique in Bonhoeffer, and he is not the only one who criticizes Barth for being too dismissive of faith.
Oh, one question real quick. I need to backtrack just a second.
Yeah.
Could you define fides qua? I figured for people listening, maybe I don't know how to pronounce it correctly, so people listening probably don't know what it is either.
I was going to
oh, sorry.
Well, for Barth, of course, there is this well-known situation that that revelation is everything. Of course, it is very important that God chooses to reveal Himself to us, and can we know about Him? That's, of course, one of the questions all people always ask to the younger Barth. Does it conceptualize, or does it remain in one or another way that what we have heard, what we have seen, what we have experienced in Revelation? And one of the familiar ways of answering that question is by the fides qua answer, which says that, well, we have our faith, we have our credos. How do you our what's the word in English? Our
doctrines, the content of the faith,
yes, of course, the doctrines. Yes, the content of the faith, which you can write down, and that's faith written down, so to say. It's a bit simple to put it that way, but that's fides qua. What do we believe? Well, there it is. There you can also say whether people do believe it or don't believe it, whether they are, and from that you can infer whether they are Christians or whether they aren't. Well, that's not Barth's answer. Certainly not the young Barth's answer. And it was a problematic answer already in the whole of the 19th century. But there is also the feeling that faith is more than only doctrine, only content. It's what faith is really about is, of course, trust. That you trust in God, in the Lord. That's the fides qua side of the answer. And for instance, Schleiermacher in the 19th century really stressed that aspect of faith and said, well, fides qua has, so to say, its own epistemology, you might even say. I don't know whether that's really good phrased, but it has its own right, and theology borders upon what fides qua is about, and how do you theology expresses fides qua, so to say. Well, Karl Barth is quite near to Schleiermacher in many respects, but he is also very critical on this point and says, well, if fides qua, the beauty of my trust in the Lord, has to reconcile me with the Lord, well, we've seen how that went wrong in the First World War, of course, in the Great War. So he was very critical about this fides qua approach as well, you could say. He also makes funny remarks about this fides qua distinction in I think the preface of Church Dogmatics 1:1. So he is very suspicious of making too much work of the concept of faith in theology. And I thought that Bonhoeffer, being very loyal to Karl Barth, very inspired by him, and very he agrees with him on the point that when there's no revelation, well, we have nothing. We cannot talk about the Lord at all. And this revelation, this actualist understanding of revelation, as you find in Karl Barth, that it has to occur again and again, so to say. You have to be in contact with the Lord, to come in contact with the Lord again and again. Bonhoeffer is very he's very grateful for that insight. I think it has a liberating impact on him. But he does feel that when we have been, when revelation has occurred to us, so to say, then what remains is not only a whole realm, as Karl Barth says, the young Karl Barth says, only, an empty hole after revelation, but what remains is faith. Might be faith, but what is that then? And that's what Bonhoeffer. There is a difference between Bonhoeffer and Barth from the very beginning, I think, on that point.
Wow, that's so interesting. In your book, you start out kind of dealing with the young Bonhoeffer and acting being, and you mentioned it just a second ago when you're kind of laying out a little bit of what the argument of acting being is, that Bonhoeffer's trying to, it seems like, modify Barth's doctrine of revelation, that he sees, he doesn't want to be able to start from the self to have any sort of human categories or faculties that have access to revelation. So exactly. He's definitely leans more to the Barthian side. But he thinks that Barth is saying that when God reveals himself, that's the only time you can really know God. And then Bonhoeffer is asking, okay, what about, if he revealed himself on Sunday and then he reveals himself again on Thursday, do I have any sort of contact with him, any sort of relationship? And do I have faith in between those days? So that seems to be, I interviewed, the only way I know that is because I interviewed Michael DeYoung like a long time ago. And he helped me through that. But so you lay out that Bonhoeffer's critique of Barth is, quote, a negativism of revelation. So I'm wondering, what do you mean by that? What does negativism of revelation mean?
Well, it's a bit playful, of course, to use those words, because I was interested, in the end, of course, I was interested in what Bonhoeffer says about this positivism of revelation thing in the prison letters. What is this? And I had the idea, I hoped that reading Act and Being might be helpful for interpreting that phrase, positivism of revelation. But when I studied Act and Being and saw that all his critique all his criticism is against this idea of revelation, that revelation always renounces, is that the word? Renounces faith. that it's always working negative upon all the things we have said or thought about Christ and God and revelation. It turns us in the wrong anytime. And well, it's a bit harsh formulated in this way, but that is that kind of is the critique of Bonhoeffer. And well, I thought that's not positivism of revelation. Revelation is not doing anything positive in this sense. Then that's you might call it negativism of revelation earlier than that. That's just a thought I had. And when I worked at title, I thought, well, might be a nice title for the for the project, because well, does this negativism of revelation then also explain what Bonhoeffer means with positivism of revelation? Was a question, of course, but this was the reason why I found this title and this term.
That's great. You go throughout your whole book detailing sort of the various encounters that Bonhoeffer has with Barth, and plenty of his critiques and sort of their interaction between their thought. I have some questions just for me, for my own homework. In your book, on page 51 and 52, you write about this encounter that Bonhoeffer has with Barth about the idea of universal reconciliation. So I will show my cards here. I told you the story off air, but I've actually never told the story on the podcast. So listeners will probably think this is interesting. So I came to Bonhoeffer after reading Metaxas's biography and Life Together. So it was a very like a very small sample size of Bonhoeffer scholarship, if you can call it that. So I was just interested, and I started my master's program at Whitworth University in Spokane, Washington. And my first class I had with my professor, the lecturer, was a Barth scholar, and he lectured on Karl Barth's doctrine of election. And I'd never heard that. I'd never heard of it ever. So I have like plenty of questions, plenty of pushback, and he just kind of answered all of it. And then at lunch, he said, "Hey, I know that you're interested in Bonhoeffer." And throughout that lecture, he was speaking in terms of reconciliation as his primary way of describing salvation. He said, "So now you kind of understand where Bonhoeffer gets it." And I thought, whoa, what do you mean? That's nothing like the person, the thoughts that I thought Bonhoeffer had about anything. This is way different from Metaxas's Bonhoeffer that I got into this knowing. I've learned very, very quickly in doing this podcast and talking to plenty of Bonhoeffer scholars that my view of Bonhoeffer when I first started was way, way off. And I've learned so much in this process. But all that to say, so I read all of Bonhoeffer, and I worked on that master's thesis, and I read it with that view in mind that Bonhoeffer agreed with Barth on these things. And then I interviewed Devin Maddox. He's a PhD student at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I sort of asked him off air, "What do you think about this?" And he said, "Oh, I don't think so." And then I thought, "Oh, well, that's interesting." And then I thought, "Oh, well, is this just another situation for Bonhoeffer studies where people make out a Bonhoeffer in their own image kind of thing?" Either side. Was Devin doing that, or was my professor doing that? What's the real understanding here? And then I went back and I emailed a bunch of people I'd interviewed already. And then I've asked every person off air that I've interviewed now, and I've gotten a different answer. Yes, no, who would be interested in that? I've gotten a different answer from everyone. So that has kind of spurred on wanting to do this research on his soteriology and find out answers to that, and just his soteriology in general. All that to say, you coming across your book was really helpful, because there were bits in there that I had never heard about. Specifically, you mentioned it a few times in your book that Bonhoeffer likely read Church Dogmatics 2:2, or the proofs of it, in their final meeting, and that quite a bit of the ethics portion kind of seeps into Bonhoeffer's own book, Ethics. Yeah. I found that really interesting, because the furthest I got to answering that question was in Eberhard Bethge's volume. There's a little paragraph there where he says, well, we can't know for sure if he's read this, but he says, but based on sort of his responses earlier about election and predestination and things like that, we can assume that he agrees. It says something like he agrees about the positive charismatic nature of these things, or something like that. I don't have it with me at the moment, but so that's about as far as I've gotten. And then, but in your book, you laid out that case, and I found it really interesting. All that to say, I wanted to ask you a few questions about that paragraph that you write about. You say, and what was to be his last discussion with Karl Barth on May 25th, 1942, he referred to the theme of universalism, probably because of the first part of Church Dogmatics 2:2. Yeah. And according to a later account of this meeting by Barth and his assistant, Charlotta von Kirschbaum, Bonhoeffer asked, quote, "Do you believe that everything will be ultimately restored? Will it be like Lake Geneva?" To which Barth replied, "Yes, like Lake Geneva." So I have a few questions there. First, what is that reference to Lake Geneva? Is it just was Lake Geneva restored? Or is it just beautiful? And Bonhoeffer is asking, will it be beautiful? What's he asking?
Yeah, I think he has been in Geneva, of course, in these travels, during these travels to Switzerland. And it's beautiful over there. It's so beautiful. So I don't think that anything was restored over there specifically. Mm-hmm. But he did probably think something like, well, heaven must be like this.
That was my first thought. I was talking to my dissertation advisor, Dr. Pilziegler, and we were talking about this, asking like, does he? Yeah, just that question. Is it just beautiful, or was it restored at some point in history?
No, I don't think so. I don't know about it, but I don't think so. I was thinking about a hymn which we have in Dutch, but you have it, what we have translated from the English, and I looked it up for you. This hymn in the Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. I don't know whether you know that song, but there's one of the verses saying, "O Sabbath rest by Galilee, O calm of hills above, where Jesus knelt to share with thee the silence of eternity, interpreted by love." Well, those hills around the lake, it's so beautiful. Heaven must be like that. I think that's the answer. So the final restoration will must be something like that. And Karl Barth was probably delighted by the image and said, "Oh yes, that must be it." Yes.
Excellent.
I think so. Yeah.
So another question about that. There's a footnote there, and you kind of reference other places where Bonhoeffer writes about the recapitulation of all things. Mm-hmm. I followed that citation to Act and Being, where you cite, and because Act and Being is just so inaccessible if you're not really familiar with it, I figured I would ask you what's going on in this citation. So I'll read it to you. It says, "Our discussion of the actus directus as something that can never be captured in reflection," and he's in parentheses, "I cannot capture the act in myself, not to mention in someone else," close parentheses, "and of infant baptism, as a faith that excludes itself, allows a perspective to open up in which not all roads appear to be blocked to the eschatology of," and I'm going to butcher this word, apokatastasis. Apokatastasis. That's it. Yes. And then he says, "And yet this very talk of apokatastasis may never be more than the sigh of theology whenever it has to speak of faith and unfaith and election and rejection. What does he mean by that? Especially specifically the sigh of theology in regards to those things. I didn't understand that, and I figured if anyone knew, you probably did.
Yes, I think I did. Well, there's also always more to be discovered, but I think I do understand him here. Well, one of the nice things of this page is that he just has quoted his favorite Luther quote about the what does it say in English? I have it here. That the curses of the godless sometimes sound better in God's ear than the hallelujahs of the pious. Bonhoeffer is writing in these pages about the distinction or the differences between belief and unbelief, faith and not faith. And in the end, we do have to talk about these differences, because of course it does matter whether you have faith or whether you haven't. But he does indicate that there may be persons whom we would call faithless, without faith, godless, but their curses might be nearer to God than our pious hallelujahs sometimes. They may connect to God through their curses in ways which a pious person may only dream about, so to say. So we must be open to the idea that those persons whom we would say they don't believe really, or they are not full of faith, that they are full of faith and that they are reconciled to God in this marvelous way. And so that's the sigh of theology he is talking about. Das Seufzen der Theologie in German. And so you cannot systematize it. You cannot say, well, of course, there's this reconciliation, this apokatastasis panton. There's this reconciliation of everything and everybody. But you have to be open to the possibility that there might be more reconciliation possible than we would possibly think, so to say. I think that's his answer in Act and Being.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. That helps me a lot.
Okay.
We can continue on with your book, though.
Yeah.
You write extensively on the various interactions of Barth with Bonhoeffer, and so given all of these interactions and all their writings and contexts and the negativism of Revelation early on, what does that lead you to understand to be Bonhoeffer's meaning in that final phrase about Barth in the Letters and Papers when he accuses Barth of having a positivism of revelation? What does that mean?
Some of the issues, of the points we have already touched upon, so I will connect to those, I think, in my answer. One of the things is that this point of you can't systemize everything. I do think that Bonhoeffer did expect that Barth was systemizing too much. For instance, on this apokatastasis point, I don't say that he was right in this. I don't think that Barth was such a systematic thinker in this respect as Bonhoeffer suspected. But I do think that there is this critique in it as well. But the more important point, I think, is that what we already talked about is the difference between faith. Well, we were talking about the importance of faith, and faith is something different than only fides quae or only theology. It's a bit too short to say that fides quae and theology are the same, but they are on the same level in a way.
Mm.
By not allowing any room for the uniqueness, so to say, of faith, Barth connects theology and faith too much with each other. The later Barth is more positive about theology at all and the possibilities of theology.
Mm-hmm.
So we can know things about God, we can speak about him, we can write thick dogmatic books about God and revelation. And he also knows why we can. That's because there is a church who has belief and who has the church who has these doctrines. But it's a matter, of course, it touches your heart, but it is a matter of intellect as well, those doctrines. And you write about them, and that's an intellectual thing you do.
Mm.
And Bonhoeffer, I think that this is what Bonhoeffer would call positivism of revelation, that revelation is being written about, being talked about, being thought about in primarily intellectual ways.
Mm-hmm.
And what Barth has less room for, he has room for it, but he doesn't really make as much work for it as Bonhoeffer wants. Is that faith is something that which well is alive in your life, in your daily life, in your when you're out on the street and meet people. Revelation might occur to you in that way as well, and you can't always find the intellectual terms for that. In acting, in praying and so on. Barth does say things about that, but his prior movement is always this intellectual movement, and I think that Bonhoeffer is critical about that, because that is not the way in which the church will have to work it out in the next few decades, is his opinion. So I think that this borders on what he might mean with this quite difficult phrase of positivism of revelation. That's I need great. Quite some words for it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It seems you lay out in your book that there's been a lot of scholarship as what does this phrase mean. It's been puzzling, but
I hope it will be helpful how I connect to those.
Yeah, definitely. It makes perfect sense when you lay out the full argument. It's great. So thank you. So I was wondering, you start out your book with the question of fides quae, fides qua. So how does this working from negativism to positivism of revelation and understanding, how does the relationship with Barth and Bonhoeffer end up answering your questions about fides quae and fides qua?
Well, I do learn from both of them. So I do agree with Barth on some points as well. More with Barth than on Bonhoeffer on some points. But the main thing I really appreciate in Bonhoeffer is that he opens some room, so to say, to think positively about human phenomena, so to say, such as the church, with all its human things in it. For Karl Barth, he is positive about the church as well. Of course, he has many positive things to say about anything you could mention about faith, church, and so on. But there is always this critical instance, this critical suspicion or this critical idea that when revelation occurs, then everything might turn out, well, different. It's a bit, again, a bit too harsh to state it in this way, but revelation is critical on everything what we can have to could possibly say about God, church, faith, and so on. This negativism of revelation is still it is still there also in his later writings, I think. And it is related to this positivism thing, I think. Well, Bonhoeffer does create room to work out positively what faith, what action, ethical actions, what I forget the word Gehorsam in German. You have to have faith, and you have to be obedient, of course. The obedience, what obedience is. Bonhoeffer has more room to explore on that and to think about it in without always having in mind, well, it might be totally different as well. No, if God has connected God's self to those human factors, so to say, then we can trust that he will be connected to what we are thinking about that. So something like that is, I think, the gain of Bonhoeffer.
That's great. I have one last question. Well, I have two questions, but one last related to this. So I have a Patreon, which allows people who listen to the podcast to contribute to sort of funding the podcast. And I do throw out usually about a month in advance, whenever I line up one of these interviews, I say, hey, this is the person I'm interviewing next. I'm going to talk to them about this book. Do you have any questions? And usually, so far, I haven't gotten really any questions, but I had someone write out a question for you. So yeah,
great,
that's great.
Great.
So one of our patrons, Chris Baker, wants to know about the how practical act and being is. For Bonhoeffer being such a practical theologian writing in discipleship and life together, it seems very concrete and everything. But act and being seems awfully abstract. So is there anything in act and being that we could take to sort of influence our daily lives?
I think Act and Being is a very important book for, well, let's be a bit rough and tough for any Bonhoeffer scholar, because it's also a very arrogant book. Is that the word, arrogant? And, yes. So yes. Bonhoeffer was 25 years old or so, and writing those very, very complicated things, which imply that he knew everything about everything, so to say. Well, it's a bit arrogant and it's very complicated. I do agree with that. But he does make some decisions about his own method, I think, in this book, especially in this book, which really helped him in construing his theology. I don't like that phrase, in thinking through theological questions in the future. I think the model of, you always have to bear in mind the act side of things and the being side of things. This model really helps him in doing theology in the future. So that's one of the answers. The other answer is that the role of the church in this book is quite flabbergasting, maybe. It looks like a very academic work, but when you've only read a few pages, you will bump into Christ as he is believed in the church, as the one who turns every question upside down. And in the church, all our epistemic and the epistemological questions will come to rest, so to say. Every act and being question which philosophy cannot in the end answer, you will find answered in Christ. That's not to say that we know the answer and that we have the answer, but in answer, those questions come to rest in Bonhoeffer's opinion. So the role the church is playing there for theology, I find this very inspiring. Also, although this is how how arrogant and irritating the book may be, I find this very inspiring in it. But of course, when Bonhoeffer went to America right after writing it, and then saw the ethical questions in New York, and the divisions in the church, and well, then of course he realized how important ethical questions were, and this is what he criticized in Act and Being later on, that ethics is not explicit in it, but I do think it is implicit in it.
That's great. Thank you. All right, one last question for you, and this was more of a fun one to get some book recommendations. It's a little game of Desert Island. If you were trapped on a desert island and you could only bring one book by Bonhoeffer, so a primary source, and one book about Bonhoeffer, secondary source, so any secondary source, it could be a biography or it could be a theology book similar to yours or something like that, which two books would you take and why?
Well, my first acquaintance with Bonhoeffer was with the Ethics, and this remains the source book for me. So when I have to go to this island, I hope not too long, with only two books, then I really think I would take the Ethics. Also because it's always such surprising stuff in it. Also, when I read passages for over and over again, I still will see new things in it. So I would choose Ethics, certainly.
Great.
And the second source book would be this one. I can show it to you, but you can't, of course, see it in the podcast. It's by Gerard Rothuizen, who was one of the first Bonhoeffer scholars in the Netherlands. I've never met him. He already died before I ever even started to study theology, but it's one of the first, well, so to say, complete theologies of Bonhoeffer, written in Dutch, I'm afraid, with a beautiful title, Aristocratisch Christendom, aristocratic Christianity. And well, I do like the way in which he is exploring Bonhoeffer. And when I was starting to read Bonhoeffer and found this book in the library, it really helped me exploring Bonhoeffer. And I expect on this lonely island that it will help me exploring Bonhoeffer once more from fresh perspectives. So I would take this one.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. That name is Rothuizen. Can you spell that for me?
Rothuizen. Rothuizen.
Perfect. All right. Well,
I'm not sure whether he has written any books in English or is translated in English, but when we were in Stellenbosch and Cape Town last year, there were a few people, Ellen Boesak, for instance, who have studied in Kampen, and they mentioned him with great, gratitude. So he was quite a fellow in the Bonhoeffer world, so to say. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Well, that's all the questions I have for you. I really appreciate you taking the time. Your book blew me away. It's given me so much to think about, and
very welcome.
So thankful for it. So I appreciate it. The book again is Negativism of Revelation, Bonhoeffer and Barth on Faith and Actualism. If anyone has any questions, they could probably find your contact on Google or something like that if they want to follow up about your book for any reason.
Very welcome.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much for just taking the time to do this, and hopefully we'll be in touch soon.
I hope so. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bonhoeffer Podcast, and thank you to Dr. Van Slot for coming on. I also wanted to provide an update about the Patreon. Our Bonhoeffer reading group that we've been talking about for the past few episodes is actually starting next week, and each patron that contributes $3 or more per month will get access to the audio for these bi-weekly reading discussion groups. So that's about 2 extra episodes a month. So we would love to have you follow along with us as we read through Bonhoeffer in chronological order. We are starting on volume 9, and for the first episode, we've read pages 1 through 200. So we'll be talking about that next week, and then if you subscribe for the $3 a month, you will get access to that audio. Also, for $1 a month, you can get access to the Bonhoeffer Podcast Discord. And if you're new to Discord, Discord is similar to Slack. It's sort of a chat service that will allow us to stay in touch about our current studies. Currently in the Discord, there are 5 or 6 of us that are mostly graduate students or postgraduate students. So we would love to have you join us and to continue to grow this community of people who are researching Bonhoeffer or just have questions, or just a layperson that just is interested. We would love to continue to study these things together. Also in the Discord, I try to give a preview of upcoming interviews of who I have booked, and give the opportunity to ask questions. As you heard on this episode, we had a question from a patron. So lots of opportunity to get connected more and to learn from each other. If you're interested in signing up, please visit patreon.com/BonhoefferPod. Special thanks to our patrons, Soren Jensen, Kevin Dykstra, Diego Reeve, Chris Baker, JT Caldwell, Wilco Ollies, Chris Sunby, Greg Harbaugh, and Arthur House. So I appreciate all the support that I've received so far in doing this. And as always, if you liked this episode, please leave a review in your favorite podcast app. It will help others find the show. That'll wrap us up for this episode. And as always, thank you so much for listening.